Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky, so now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax. After the horrible crash of Germanwings Flight 9525, where a pilot locked his colleague out of the cockpit and then flew his aircraft straight into a French mountainside, most people would find it unthinkable that a pilot would ever be left alone inside of a cockpit of a passenger aircraft. And yet, here we have a pilot completely alone in the cockpit, with his colleague desperately trying to get in from outside the locked door again. How is that possible? Stay tuned. Saturday the 17th of February 2024 was a cloudy and damp day in Frankfurt, Germany. It had been raining throughout the morning, and with the temperature hovering around 10 degrees Celsius, the two Lufthansa pilots who were scheduled to operate flight 1140 down towards Seville in Spain were likely quite happy to do so. This was going to be the last day of a 4-day rotation that these pilots had flown together, and to finish a duty with two nice long sectors at a reasonable time in the morning is normally a bit of a luxury. The captain was 43 years old at the time and was currently rated on the Airbus A320 family. And the final report gave no details on how many total hours or hours on the type that he had, but we do know that his medical license had no limitations on it apart from him having to wear glasses, which is something a lot of commercial pilots, including myself, have. His colleague, the first officer, was 38 years old and was flying on something known as an MPL, a multi-pilot license, which had first been issued back in 2019. So even though we don't know his exact number of flight hours either, we can assume that by the time of this flight he was quite experienced. His medical license was also without limitations, and he had undergone his last medical examination back in May of 2023, with nothing out of the ordinary noted. Now, I'm talking about medical licenses here, so maybe this is a good time to explain a bit about what's required from a commercial pilot when it comes to medical fitness. I will refer to European EASA rules here, but the rules are similar all around the world. Before anyone can get licensed to fly any type of aircraft, they have to go through something known as an initial medical certification. Now, the requirements are lower if you only intend to fly recreationally, in which case you will need a Class 2 or even something known as an LAPL, Light Aircraft Pilot Medical License. But if you intend to fly commercially, meaning as an airline pilot, taxi pilot or flight instructor for example, well, then you will need to get a Class 1 medical. The requirements for that are much stricter and requires an initial examination at something known as an aeromedical center, where your vision, heart function, color vision and many other things needs to fall within certain criteria. Once a pilot has passed that initial examination, which normally takes about a day to get through, the Class 1 medical then has to be annually renewed through a less detailed medical examination, which can be done at either an aeromedical center or by an aeromedical examiner, an AME, which is a doctor authorized to do these tests. Now, there are more details involved here, but the point I want to make is that a pilot's health is monitored throughout their career, and any decline in health, use of medicine or medical procedure needs to be reported to the pilot's AME and evaluated to make sure that the medical fitness to fly is still valid. As you can imagine, this is a source of quite some worry and anxiety in the industry, since our livelihoods are so closely connected to our health. But there are special types of insurances called loss of license insurances that have been created exactly for this reason. These insurances come in different formats, but will normally pay out either a lump sum or a monthly stipend if a pilot should suddenly lose the medical. Anyway, that was a little bit of a sidestep, but I think it is important that you understand the background before we continue this story. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the two pilots met up in the crew room in Frankfurt Airport to start planning for their coming two flights. The 3 previous days had been really nice, and they had both enjoyed each other's company, with the captain finding the first officer to be both SOP-minded and very competent. The weather at their destination, Seville, was forecasted to be sunny but not particularly warm, and all in all, despite the grey weather in Germany, the day's operations looked pretty straightforward. There were no major NOTAMs to worry about, and the flight plans both looked pretty standard. So the two pilots soon decided on how much fuel they wanted and then walked over to brief their 4 cabin crew members about the day. Once that was done, they then all walked together out towards the gate where their aircraft was already waiting for them. Now, these pilots were rated on the Airbus A320 family, and on this day they were going to operate the longest member of this group, the Airbus A321. That's a beautiful, long and sleek aircraft with 2 IAE V2500 high bypass turbofan engines mounted under its wings. And the fact that this was an Airbus is soon going to have a major impact on this story. As the crew were walking down towards their aircraft, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to fly the aircraft down to Seville, and the captain was then going to be pilot monitoring. They would then switch the roles on the way home, and generally speaking, this is often the way that I would choose to do things as well on the first flight of the day. You see, doing the first sector as pilot monitoring gives me as a captain some extra time to look through the tech log properly and to do the first walk around, which is always nice. So, said and done, once the tech log had been reviewed and found to have no important outstanding items in it, the captain went outside and the first officer started preparing the aircraft for departure. And since this was the very first flight of that day, those checks would have included a functional check of the bulletproof cockpit door, which is something that I will get back to later. In any case, the passengers soon also started boarding, and at around time 09:35, all 199 of them were in their seats, meaning that the aircraft had a total head count of 205 when the cabin crew started closing the doors for departure. The last few checks were then completed, and at time 09:41, Lufthansa Flight 1140 initiated its pushback from gate A13 and then started the engines as normal. After that, the pilots requested taxi instructions and then started taxiing out towards runway 18, which was the active runway for departure on that morning. So far, so good. All pre-departure checks went off smoothly with nothing out of the ordinary. So at time 09:57, the first officer moved the thrust levers into the flex detent position and the aircraft started accelerating down the runway. The takeoff and initial climb went off without any problems, and they were soon cleared to turn westwards towards Paris and asked to climb up to their planned cruising level of flight level 350. Now, once we pilots reach the cruise level, there are loads of different minor tasks that needs to be performed. Generally, the pilot monitoring will fill in things like the off-block and takeoff time in the electronic flight plan, verify the actual fuel burned against the plan, and then start noting down times that we pass over certain waypoints in order to follow up on the flight plan. The pilot flying will monitor the instruments and apply any changes to the route that the controller might give us, but this is also when we tend to ask for our second cup of coffee, especially in the morning. So even though that wasn't specifically mentioned in the report, I'm guessing that this was the case here as well, and what goes in will eventually come out. Now, before we go any further, there are a few things that I need to explain to you regarding how we pilots monitor each other for potential medical issues, as well as how our lives and work have been affected by a couple of horrific historical events. If we start with incapacitation checks, it's very important to remember that even though we have our medical class 1 licenses, we are still very much human and can therefore fall ill just like everyone else. This is why it is so important that there are 2 pilots in the cockpit, because in the very unlikely event of one of the pilots getting sick, the remaining pilot is both trained and able to safely get the aircraft, passengers and crew down on the ground again. Now, incapacitations can be either obvious or subtle, meaning that they can vary from a sudden heart attack and immediate unconsciousness to psychological issues or illnesses where a pilot just stops making sense or start acting in strange and inappropriate ways. The way we mitigate against these things is by continuously just keeping a friendly eye on our colleague, looking out for any of these signs. But it's also done through the use of strict standard operating procedures, SOPs, which must be done in a certain order and with certain specific callouts. If a pilot starts deviating from those procedures or doesn't respond to a callout, well, then that's a sign of possible incapacitation, and we then normally try to draw attention to that deviation or make a second clear callout. Now, if there is still no response to that, well, then we start activating the pilot incapacitation protocol, which I will soon get back to. This is known as the two-call rule and is, to my knowledge, used by basically all airlines out there. The second thing I want to talk about is the multitude of ways that our lives have changed as a result of the horrific terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 in New York. Before that, the flight crew's lives were much simpler and much more innocent. Sure, there had been hijackings before, but those were always either political or due to some kind of mental issue. No one had even considered that an aircraft full of passengers could be hijacked and used as a weapon. But after 9/11, we were all faced with this horrible new reality, and as a direct result, the cockpit had to be closed and protected in completely new ways. It took a few years of debate in the industry, but starting quite soon after the attacks in May of 2003, all passenger category cockpits started being outfitted with special lockable security doors. These doors could withstand handgun bullets, as well as all sorts of other abuse, in order to stop any unauthorized person from entering. And with the locked cockpit door now came a whole host of other, more subtle threats. One of them was that cabin crew and flight crew now became divided into two more or less separate teams, which came with its own CRM and communication difficulties. But the most obvious problem was how to secure access to the cockpit for the right people, and at the same time making sure that the wrong people would not enter under any circumstances. Now, this might sound easy, but if you think about it, it is actually quite hard. You see, most aircraft don't have lavatories in the cockpit, which means that the pilots will have to leave the cockpit at regular intervals during a working day when nature calls. This therefore necessitates specific procedures for how to do this, whilst not creating a potential for a nefarious actor to utilize those moments as a security weakness. Now, for obvious reasons, I will not go into how these procedures work in detail, but all airlines have their own variations, and what you need to know is that a fundamental principle of all these procedures is that the pilots in the cockpit must have the ability to deny entry from the outside no matter what happens. This was seen as an absolute necessity after the 9/11 attacks, since potential hijackers could also potentially take crew or passengers hostage and try to pressure them into giving up their security protocols. But as long as the pilots could then stop whoever tried to get in anyway, that would be of absolutely no use, and the aircraft could not be turned into a weapon. Or so everyone thought. But what no one had considered was how this system would work in case a pilot would try to utilize it to do something unthinkable. And then came Germanwings Flight 9525. Now, I will likely tell you that full story at some point. I haven't done so far because I always want my videos to be constructive and show how the industry learned from even the most terrible of accidents. But in the case of that particular flight, there is very little to learn. It's mostly just pitch black darkness. Anyway, the gist of that story is that the co-pilot of the flight, who was allegedly suffering from some psychological issues at the time, took the chance when the captain went to the toilet to lock the cockpit door and then denied the captain re-entry. After that, he selected a descent mode on his Airbus's mode control panel and flew the aircraft and the 150 passengers and crew on board straight into a mountainside in the French Alps. Now, when I eventually make a video about this, I will have found something constructive about it, likely around mental health. But what you need to understand for this video is that this crash opened up a whole new can of worms for the aviation industry. It was a tragedy that had been made possible exactly because of a security system that had been put in place. So what could now be done about that? Well, One pretty obvious thing that the industry quickly suggested was that no one should ever be left alone in the cockpit going forward. So EASA, the European Aviation Regulator, soon formulated what's known as a SIB, a Safety Information Bulletin, with number 2015-04. In that, they recommended that there should be 2 qualified persons in the cockpit at all times. If a pilot needed to go to the toilet, well, then a cabin crew member should enter and stay behind, monitoring the remaining pilot. Now, most airlines at the time already had such a rule in place. Not to guard against suicidal pilots, but to make sure that if the remaining pilot would suffer from some kind of illness, they could quickly help, and also to potentially open the locked cockpit door for the pilot outside. But the problem was that this procedure had not been applied by all airlines before, and the few who hadn't now either conformed to this recommendation or were very against it, arguing that this rule introduced completely new security weaknesses. So, in light of that criticism, EASA re-evaluated their stance, and in 2016 they came out with a slightly altered SIB, who basically said that it was up to the operator to do a proper assessment of the risks involved. And based on that assessment, they could then decide if they wanted to use a 2-person minimum in the cockpit or not. Which brings us to Lufthansa and their procedures. So the company Germanwings, who suffered that horrible tragedy with Flight 9525 back in 2015, was a wholly owned subsidiary to Lufthansa. So initially, after that tragedy, they quickly implemented a fleet-wide adoption of the first SIB, requiring 2 people in the cockpit at all times. But then, as the years went on and in agreement with that latest SIB, the company made a reassessment of the risks and decided that having 2 persons in the cockpit was no longer needed, at least in cruise for short periods like for a toilet break. The pilot leaving the cockpit was still supposed to evaluate the physical and psychological fitness of the remaining pilot, but if that all looked okay, well then he or she could be left alone. Now, I know that there's likely a lot of people out there just cringing when they hear this, and whilst I'm sure that Lufthansa had very compelling safety statistics to motivate that decision, I personally don't really understand it. Sure, the likelihood of a pilot's suicide is thankfully very, very low, but not zero, as Germanwings 9525 had clearly shown. And on top of that, pilot incapacitations do also happen, and they don't always come with warning signs. Actually, recent research found 39 cases of pilot incapacitations under FAA rules during a 6-year period, and another study made in 2004 in the United Kingdom found 36 incapacitations and 4 sudden deaths in only 1 year. These type of studies have been conducted all over the world, all with very similar results, and the major causes of pilot incapacitations included loss of consciousness, gastrointestinal issues, neurological events like epileptic seizures, as well as cardiovascular problems like heart attacks. Now, the reason that you don't often hear about these are, like I mentioned before, because of the presence of that second pilot, who is more than capable of keeping the aircraft flying and bringing it down safely. But that's providing that they are actually in the cockpit. So this all brings us back to Lufthansa Flight 1140, who was now proceeding steadily down towards Seville. At around time 10:30, the captain felt the inevitable result of his morning coffee, so he informed his colleague that he needed to go to the bathroom. They had just passed into Spanish airspace at the time, but there was still plenty of distance left before they had to start preparing for the approach, so this would have been the perfect time to get this done. The 2 pilots then discussed the weather ahead as well as some minor plans for the immediate operation of the aircraft before the captain initiated the procedure for opening the door to get outside. Now again, for security reasons, I will not go into what these procedures entails, but what you need to know is that every airline have their own dedicated procedures that needs to be followed to the letter before the cockpit door is ever opened in flight. That weather and operational discussion that the pilots had just had formed part of the captain's checking up on his colleague, as their procedures actually stipulated. But since they had been flying for 4 days together at this point and the first officer was looking and sounding perfectly fine, I don't think that the captain was very worried here. As this was going on, the aircraft was about 90 miles northeast of Madrid, talking to the northern Madrid control sector, somewhere close to Zaragoza. And before the captain had a chance to get out of his seat, the controller called the aircraft up, asking if they were experiencing any turbulence, to which the captain answered, "Only light chop." Then, at time 10:31 and 30 seconds, the captain handed over the radios to the first officer, who would now be in charge of both the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring roles. He then got out of his seat, checked the galley area, and exited the cockpit with the cockpit door locking securely behind him. The first officer was now completely alone, with a bulletproof door between him and his colleague. 46 seconds after the captain had left, the cockpit voice recorder started recording sounds of the first officer experiencing some sort of sudden and severe incapacitation. And during the following minute, several out-of-sequence and unrelated system selections were then picked up by the flight data recorder. These included the disconnection of spoiler and elevator computer number 3, which can be done from a push button on the overhead panel, the weather radar being switched from weather and turbulence over to turbulence only, which is done from a rotary switch on the central pedestal. And the Morse code for the tune VOR, Bravo Alpha November, suddenly starting to sound in the cockpit, which is something that must be selected from the corresponding reception knob on the audio control panel. Now, these actions make no sense at all and are therefore likely signs of the co-pilot's arms just flaying around in the cockpit or of uncontrollable actions just randomly happening. The deactivation of the SEC-3 also triggered a master caution and an associated ECAM warning, but this was not the only thing the first officer's seizure was now causing. No, the next thing was far more terrifying. You see, the flight data recorder now also picked up a sudden increase in force applied to the first officer's right rudder pedal, a force reaching 488 Newton. Now, both the autopilot and autothrust was engaged at this point, but a fundamental principle in most autopilots is that if a pilot is starting to input on the controls, well, then the aircraft should assume that the pilot needs to override whatever the autopilot is doing and just disconnect. That's certainly the case in the Boeing 737 that I fly. Well, if the rudder input would be very, very small, well, then the Boeing's autopilot could initially try and counteract it with aileron to maintain the intended course. But if the input would be bigger than what the ailerons can handle, then the autopilot would just disengage. And with that hard right rudder being applied, this would then lead to a sudden right yaw, followed by a roll to the right and an eventual spiral dive if the rudder input is maintained. Now, fortunately for everyone on board, the autopilot on the Airbus works slightly differently. Since it uses fly-by-wire, this sudden rudder input was now fed to the aircraft's flight control computers, who evaluated the input and found it highly inappropriate. So instead of allowing the full input to activate the rudder, it only let through a very small amount, causing a 5-degree roll and a 2-degree heading change, whilst also issuing a stop rudder input ECAM warning, together with another master caution warning. Now, I cannot overemphasize just how important this safety feature was here. If the aircraft would have instead initiated the yaw, which the seizing pilot's right leg was now asking for, the ensuing yaw and spiral dive could have created large and increasing G-forces, which in turn could have made it very difficult for anyone outside of the cockpit to even try to gain access. And with no one inside except for the incapacitated first officer, there would have been no way to then rectify the situation unless he would suddenly recover by himself. Now, it's important as well to say that the Airbus system also has a limit value of pilot input, after which it will disconnect. And from what I have been able to find, that sits at around 45 to 50 decanewton, including some further criteria. So, with the first officer now pushing 488 Newton, or 48.8 decanewton, that limit could not have been far off. But the important thing was that it didn't happen. Instead, the aircraft just continued its flight on autopilot along airway Upper November 857 towards waypoint Baneb. But with no conscious pilot by its controls. Now, during the initial minute of this incapacitation, the northern Madrid control sector tried to contact the aircraft on 3 separate occasions in order to transfer them over to the next sector, but obviously without receiving any reply. The controller therefore called up the next sector to try and see if the aircraft had somehow already transferred over there, but just as it did so, another Lufthansa flight called up, which was then erroneously interpreted as Flight 1140 by the northern controller. So this all meant that air traffic control didn't raise any prolonged loss of communication alarm as this was happening. Now, outside in the passenger cabin, no one had initially noticed anything out of the ordinary. So when the pilot was done in the bathroom, he came out and initiated the procedure for regaining access to the cockpit. And even though, again, I can't go into the specifics here, what I can tell you is that the lock for the cockpit door includes a keypad programmed with several different codes. One of those can be used to just notify the pilot remaining in the cockpit that someone is asking for permission to enter. And that pilot should then verify that nothing nefarious is going on before deciding to manually unlock the door. So the captain now entered this code, but got no response back. He assumed that he had just put the wrong code in, so he tried again, still with no response, and then again, and again, and again. Still nothing. Now, I cannot even imagine the kind of horror that must have been going through the mind of this captain as each new attempt failed. Remember, this was more or less exactly how the German wings disaster had started. There is also an emergency code created precisely for this kind of situation, which, if entered, will cause a very different tone to sound in the cockpit. If this code is entered, the pilot inside the cockpit can still deny entry to whoever is trying it, but if there is no response from the cockpit, like in the case of an incapacitation, well, then the door will automatically unlock after a time delay. So this code was now entered, followed by what must have been the longest seconds of this captain's life. But luckily, the first officer must have now recovered slightly from the worst of his seizures and could therefore manually unlock the door before the timer had run out. But before we get to what happened next, I just want to point something out here. The control panel for the cockpit door in the Airbus cockpit uses a toggle switch, which can be toggled to either lock or unlock, depending on what the pilot wants. If the emergency code is entered and the pilot thinks that it's a security threat, they can therefore choose the lock position, which will then stop any further entry attempts for a predetermined time. This is a super important security feature, making sure that hijackers cannot get access to the cockpit. But for a lonely pilot in the cockpit suffering from seizures, I would say that the risk of that button being toggled in the wrong direction by mistake would be quite high. And if that would have happened here, no help would have been able to enter, at least not for a while. So I personally think that this incident clearly shows that there should always be at least 2 qualified people inside the cockpit whilst airborne. Whatever security concerns that the opponents of this rule have cannot possibly outweigh the risk of incapacitation, and I won't even start on the idiotic move towards single-pilot cockpits, which the FAA and EASA are apparently now looking at. My friend and fellow captain Ben and I had a long discussion about this in our podcast, Captain Speaking, recently, and you can check out our very unscripted thoughts on that topic here. And by the way, please consider subscribing to that new channel, and you can also listen to it wherever you find your podcasts. Anyway, the captain now finally gained access to the cockpit, and the first thing that you need to do in a situation like this is to take control of the aircraft, remove the incapacitated pilot from the controls, and then verify the position of all relevant controls and switches. So that's exactly what this captain now did, which included going through those ECAM actions indicated on his screens in order to reset the correct configuration. And that was then followed by him asking for help from his cabin crew to check on his colleague. And in this case, they could clearly see that the first officer was still pale, sweating and moving around strangely. So he was quickly removed from his seat and taken out to the forward galley, where a doctor who was traveling as a passenger attended to him and also diagnosed a possible heart condition. Based on that information, the captain decided that he needed to divert in order to give his colleagues some proper medical attention. But here, it's very important to point out a few things about these kind of situations. When we practice piloting capacitations in the simulator, it's super important to highlight to the remaining pilot that the overall safety of the aircraft and its passengers takes priority over the sick colleague. This means that we must still maintain our normal safety margins and not to rush things just to try to get down quickly. We will obviously speed up as much as possible, ask for a priority and so on, but it's very important not to get yourself sucked into trying to take shortcuts, which could end up in a non-stabilized approach or something even worse. It's important to remember that not only is this going to be a non-normal, non-briefed maneuver, it will also be flown without the normal backup from a competent colleague, something that we normally always otherwise have. In this case, the captain quickly contacted the Northern Madrid controller, which he had been talking to before, and that controller must have been very surprised, since he thought that the flight had already left his frequency. Initially, the captain asked for a diversion towards Madrid, which was now behind them for medical reasons, but he later also declared a full medical emergency, and the controller obviously complied. Now, one thing that stuck out to me here was that medical emergency call. You see, a medical emergency is what we normally call for when a passenger or cabin crew member falls ill, but when we're down to only one pilot, it's actually more prudent to declare a Mayday, Mayday, Mayday pilot incapacitation, as that is a far more critical emergency. Declaring pilot incapacitation will, for example, tell the air traffic controllers to slow down and reduce the workload on the remaining pilot, and in the case of a captain incapacitation, it can also mean that the aircraft can't be maneuvered on the ground after landing, since the nose wheel tiller is only available on the captain's side on some aircraft types. This also gives me the chance to answer some questions I normally get when I talk about pilot incapacitation procedures. If it is the captain who gets sick, the first officer should not change seats, even if he or she then is the de facto commander of the aircraft. This is because they have no training to fly the aircraft from the left side, and the same goes for taxiing the aircraft after landing. It's far better to just advise the controller that you won't be able to taxi on the ground, so the runway will be blocked after landing, and just prepare for an engine shutdown on the runway to allow emergency vehicles to approach and help your sick colleague from there. The same generally also goes for using autolands. Even though an autoland might sound like a great option in these circumstances, it depends heavily on what type of training that the first officer or captain has received. If they are not used to do autolands from their seats and the weather is good, well then a normal landing is often preferable, since it deviates less from what the remaining pilot is used to. Now, if you have more questions about this, please write them down in the comments below, and Ben and I might choose your question to answer in our next podcast. Anyway, Flight 1140 now quickly started its descent and soon received progressive radar vectors towards Madrid. In the cockpit, the captain would have then set up for the arrival by himself, as well as done all of the applicable performance calculations and briefings. And when it comes to briefings, this is actually another thing that I always used to emphasize when I was teaching these kind of scenarios. It might feel super silly to be sitting up there just talking to yourself, but it is actually critically important that this is done. Briefings often include things like cross-checking that the minimas are set, as well as other crucial functions, and in the case of the Boeing 737 that I fly, the plus 50 and minima call made by the aircraft is triggered from whatever minima is set on the captain's side. This means that if a first officer finds him or herself in a situation like this and doesn't call out the minimas as part of their briefing, well, then they might forget to set it on the captain's side and therefore get incorrect calls on the approach, which is literally the last thing that you need. On top of that, it's also advisable to keep a cabin crew in the cockpit during approach and landing to help with things like reading the checklist and check on the well-being of the remaining pilot. Now, these procedures might differ from airline to airline, but for the same reason that one pilot shouldn't be left alone in the first place, the now only remaining pilot shouldn't be left alone either. If a cabin crew is to remain in the cockpit, then he or she should sit down on the jump seat and not in the empty pilot seat, since they are not trained to sit there. I always use the quick reference handbook, QRH, which includes all of the applicable checklists, and let them read the descent, approach and landing checklist from there, but that's just my own procedure. When it comes to how to fly the aircraft, again, the most important thing here is to try and stay as close to the normal procedures as possible. This includes making all of the normal call-outs, but since the remaining pilot will now be both the pilot flying and pilot monitoring, he or she will now need to do both set of calls. So, flaps 1, speed checks, flaps 1, and so on. Again, this might feel a bit silly, but all of those calls have important functions, so calling them out and playing both roles will keep the remaining pilots in a familiar setting, which will hopefully reduce stress and mistakes. Remember, pilots are not used to fly airliners silently, so to start doing that in a situation like this would not be a great idea. Also, once the pilot has everything under control and have formulated a plan, like in this case where the captain decided to divert to Madrid, it's then super important to keep everyone else in the loop. Air traffic control maybe knows what's going on, but they still need to know what you're planning to do, and so does your cabin crew and the passengers. So when the workload is suitable, maybe during a long descending vector, it's important that the pilot gives the cabin crew something known as a NITS briefing, which stands for the nature of the problem, intentions, in this case going to Madrid, time available, typically around 20 to 25 minutes for a diversion from cruise if there's an airport close by, and finally, special procedures that might be needed. Here, for example, it would be important to follow normal procedures and passenger announcements, but also to instruct the passengers to remain seated after landing in order to allow quick access for the medical staff. And after that, it is time for the pilot's PA. And in this case, a public announcement is absolutely crucial. Remember that a big portion of the aircraft might have actually seen that a pilot has been removed from the cockpit and is now receiving medical care in the front. And not all passengers knows that the aircraft can be flown safely by only one pilot, especially if that pilot happens to be the first officer. So with that in mind, this PA must be made in a calm and competent manner, outlining what you're going to do and supporting the authority of your cabin crew. And it also could include some type of short information about what the passengers can expect after, like, once the medical personnel have assisted my colleague, I will inform you about your ongoing travel plans. That will take focus away from the emergency and instead point it forward towards their own travel plans, which normally fills a comforting function. So as you can see, there are a lot of things to think about in an emergency like this, but as always, the most important guiding principle is aviate, navigate and communicate in that order. In any case, flight 1140 was eventually vectored in for the ILS approach for runway 32 left in Madrid-Barajas Airport, and at time 11:04 UTC, it landed safely and then taxied off the runway. Since the captain had asked for the attendance of an ambulance on arrival, the aircraft was guided by a follow-me car to a stand close by the runway, where the first officer was then quickly offloaded and rushed to a nearby hospital. And after several tests, it was eventually concluded that the seizures that he had suffered from was the result of a previously undiagnosed neurological condition. And that sadly will mean that he likely won't be able to continue flying. As part of the post-flight interviews, the first officer also stated that he had lost consciousness at some point after the captain had left the cockpit, and that he had no memories of anything else until he woke up on the galley floor whilst being attended to by the cabin crew and the doctor. So all in all, this aircraft had been flown without a conscious pilot at the controls for about 10 whole minutes. After the first officer had been removed by the ambulance, the captain arranged for buses to the terminal for the passengers and crew, or possibly for the aircraft to be towed to the stand first. The report was a bit unclear about that. But he also remembered to protect both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which made it much easier for the investigators to look into what had really happened. They finally determined that the first officer's incapacitation had been caused by that previously undetected neurological condition, something that had never previously manifested itself to neither the pilot nor his doctors. The investigators also examined loads of international reports on pilot incapacitations, and based on that, they issued a recommendation to EASA to inform all operators out there about this event, so that they could use it to reassess the need for a second person in the flight deck at all times, something that both the investigators and I found to be a very good idea. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments here below. It's May the 11th, 1996 in Miami, United States. A 27-year-old DC-932 with tail number November 904 Victor Juliet sits at the gate in the sweltering Florida heat. Up in the cockpit are two professionals who has done the upcoming route countless times. A captain who has just turned 35 with an already long and successful career behind her, including close to 9,000 hours of total time and 2,116 hours on the DC-9. And a 52-year-old first officer with 6,448 hours in total and 2,148 on this same aircraft. Behind them, three young flight attendants move through a nearly full cabin, where the 105 passengers are settling in for a short hour-and-a-half-long hop over to Atlanta. It's a perfectly normal day, an ordinary route on an airplane that has made this trip more times than anyone can remember. The writing on the aircraft side says Valujet, which is an upstart carrier featuring cartoon critters on the nose and who offers fares that undercuts all of the big guys in the industry. This makes Valujet one of the products of the new era in American flying of no-frills, low-cost airlines. But most people on board don't care about the business acumen or strategy of this airline. For them, what matters is just getting to Atlanta safely by dinner time, for the same or even less money than it would cost them to drive the same distance. At this point, they have already had a small delay. The jet and its crew arrived late from Atlanta at 13:10, so the planned 1 o'clock departure has already slipped a bit, but not so much that anyone is complaining. The flight's call sign on this day is Critter 592, and the pilots up front are focused and concentrated on trying to minimize any further delays as much as possible. They know the taxiways at Miami almost by heart, and they also know the flight corridor and route that they're about to follow, but the captain still briefs the departure thoroughly. Like I mentioned, she has just turned 35 and is now excited to celebrate with her friends once she gets back to Atlanta. She just has to complete this last flight of the day first. Right before pushback, baggage handlers arrive with one last shipment to load. A few boxes of Valujet company materials and plane parts, including some tires. None of the items are marked as anything particularly interesting or noteworthy, so the first officer, seeing that the paperwork is in order, just signs it off. With everything looking good, this cargo then gets loaded, after which the ground handlers finally close the forward cargo door and starts getting ready for departure. And at time 13:40, the aircraft doors are closed and the pilots finish up the last bit of pre-flight procedures and checklists. The captain will be pilot flying for this leg, so she soon asks her colleague to request push and start, which is quickly approved, and Critter 592 starts moving away from the gate. The plane that they're flying today dates back to the 60s and has quite a few technical items listed in its minimum equipment list. That's the list of items that are allowed to be inoperative for dispatch. The left fuel flow gauge is broken, the autopilot has been inoperative for days at this point, the interphone that allows the cabin crew to talk to the pilots is also broken, and the PA system is working intermittently, which forced the crew to make announcements using a megaphone on the previous flight from Atlanta over to Miami. Now, we actually still have those megaphones available today to be used in emergency or after a loss of electrical power, but the sound quality in those are horrendous. They're really only good for emergency evacuation commands. In any case, the DC-9 soon finishes its pushback and the crew starts up one of the two engines, but delays starting the second one until later. Fuel needs to be saved. Once the before taxi checklist is completed, the first officer requests taxi and the aircraft soon turns out towards the active runway 09 left and then joins the afternoon flow. In the cockpit, the two pilots occupy their time waiting in the taxi queue by pointing out old and classic planes that are parked at Miami for maintenance. One of them gets excited to see a Constellation, and the other one points out a mighty Boeing 747. But the progression of this flight is so far completely unremarkable. Slow turns past maintenance hangars and half-painted tails, a pause for crossing traffic, then the long parade towards runway 09 left. The pilots continue their practice routine. The takeoff brief is squared away and the flows are completed once the second engine is finally started. The same flow as they have followed countless times. Behind and below them, in the cramped forward cargo compartment under the passenger cabin, the load sits exactly as it was left. And that includes those tires and the 5 cardboard boxes that I mentioned before. Whilst carefully lining up her aging DC-9, the captain soon looks down the centerline, stretching away into the distance. Critter 592, cleared for takeoff, announces the tower controller, and as the first officer reads this back, the captain moves the thrust levers up to stabilize the engines and then advances them into the takeoff position. But as this is happening, below in the dark cargo compartment, a quiet hiss is now growing into something completely different. The two pilots have no idea, but this might be the last point at which they can save themselves and their passengers. Because now, something akin to a bomb is sitting inside of those cardboard boxes, and the fuse has just been lit. Several months before Flight 592 ever pushed back, the story of what's about to happen had already been set in motion inside of a maintenance hangar a few miles away. And to understand why there were boxes in that forward hold at all, we have to start by talking about the airline involved. Valujet had burst onto the scene as one of the first true ultra-low-cost carriers in the US after the deregulation of the aviation industry in 1978. The company's pitch was simple and irresistible. No frills, rock-bottom fares, airplanes flying hard, and overhead kept lean by outsourcing almost everything that could be outsourced. The company owned the schedule, the brand and the tickets, but external contractors then did almost all of the heavy lifting. Now this was initially hugely successful, and the airline's founder often bragged about his stock price and how quickly the airline had made it to profitability. But the cost squeeze needed to make those numbers was relentless. Major maintenance checks had been outsourced to third-party shops. Specialist tasks like avionics, interiors and structural work went to even more contractors, often with even more subcontractors beneath them. And even though this was efficient on paper and brutally cost-effective in practice, it also placed safety on a tight leash made out of paperwork and trust. If a contractor would miss a step, well then the airline had to be good and present enough to catch it, and that was the crux here, because Valujet ran a very light personnel ship. Crews were paid less than legacy carriers were. New hires often bore the cost of their own training, and maintenance inspectors or tech reps could not be everywhere at once. So this model really only worked if everyone always did exactly the right thing. Maybe you see where this is going. In January of 1996, Valujet then acquired 3 used MD-80s and sent them to a company called SaberTech in Miami for some heavy maintenance work. Basically, work equivalent to something between a C and a D check, meaning that large parts of the aircraft would have to be checked through thoroughly. Now, SaberTech was a certified maintenance and repair operator with a pretty high workload of its own, so they were used to ramping up fast, bringing in temporary hands and farming out specialized tasks when needed. On the MD-80 program alone, hundreds of people were cycled through the organization, and a large share of those spoke English as a second language. Now that wasn't a problem in itself, but it made precise, unambiguous instructions very important. The instructions for how to do each mechanical task was printed on what was called a work card, who were designed to be clear and unambiguous, something that we will get back to soon. Two of the airplanes that Valujet had bought, November 802 Victor Victor and November 803 Victor Victor, arrived to SaberTech with their passenger oxygen systems at or near the 12-year shelf life. That means the maximum time certified by the manufacturer that the chemical oxygen generators in the overhead panels were allowed to be installed before they had to be replaced. So one of the instructions given to the maintenance workers was pretty straightforward and specified on the Valujet's work card number 0069. The team needed to remove the old generators, 144 of them in total, install new ones, record the work according to the work card, and then get going with the next work card as quickly as possible. Now, in a hangar full of bigger, heavier and noisier tasks, this looked like a pretty easy one. But it wasn't, and here's why. You see, the oxygen in the masks that drop down from above your seat in an emergency is not supplied in the same way as the oxygen that we pilots get in the cockpit. We use compressed oxygen from a bottle stored somewhere close to the cockpit, and those bottles are both heavy and need to be topped up regularly. So to avoid having to use those type of bottles for all passengers, your mask is instead hooked up to an oxygen generator, which can sit unused for years and then on demand deliver enough oxygen to allow us pilots to make an emergency descent down to more breathable conditions. These generators come in the form of small steel cylinders tucked above each row, each one being a fascinating compact chemistry kit. When the mask drops down from the ceiling, the passengers should reach up and pull the mask down to their face. You've likely seen this being demonstrated loads of times already by cabin crew. When you do this, the tug pulls on a lanyard attached to a retaining pin, which in turn holds back a spring-loaded hammer. So when that retaining pin is pulled away, the hammer strikes a percussion cap, which is basically a tiny explosive charge. Inside of each can is also a cylinder of sodium chlorate, which you can think of as a solid oxygen battery. Its crystals hold a lot of oxygen locked inside, and when the percussion cap is struck by the pin, it fires a charge into a tiny igniter that starts the chemical reaction by sending a jet of hot gas into a hollow channel cut into the middle of the generator's sodium chloride cylinder. Now, sodium chloride contains sodium, chlorine and oxygen all bound up together, but in a pretty unstable combination. It wants to break down into more stable things like table salt or sodium chloride and pure oxygen. And all that's needed to trigger this decomposition is the heat and energy from the percussion cap. To keep the process going smoothly, the mix usually also includes a little iron powder, which is basically a very fine metal kindling. And the first puff of oxygen lets that iron burn into rust, giving off some extra heat. That helps heat up more sodium chloride that then also decomposes, causing a chain reaction that spreads at a steady, sustainable rate until all of the sodium chloride has been used up. Other tiny additives then help mop up unwanted byproducts, so the gas that comes out into your mask is almost pure oxygen, which is then mixed with the surrounding air for you to breathe. Now, this process generates pure oxygen gas for around 15 to 20 minutes, while all of the non-oxygen leftovers stay trapped inside of that can. But there is a catch here, and that's heat. You see, the reaction that spits out the oxygen is what's known as an exothermic one. That means that the chemical reaction generates its own heat, and a lot of it. For this reason, generators are carefully placed into metal and ceramic heat shielding that carries the heat away during normal operation. And this is also why you might feel a smell of burning if you're ever in an aircraft where this system is activated. That's the smell of dust burning off the top of those cylinders. The generators that the SaberTech mechanics removed could run hot enough to blister paint, well above 280 degrees Celsius. And that's also hot enough to ignite most organic matter, allowed to touch them while they were producing oxygen. If that would happen, unlike a traditional fire, a fire started by an oxygen generator wouldn't need oxygen from the surrounding air to sustain itself, because it would come from the generator itself. So, if you remember the fire triangle that I've mentioned in some of my previous videos, Well, these units basically supplies 2 out of the 3 sides to it. Because of that, safe handling of these oxygen generators once removed requires one crucial item: a safety cap. If a generator is removed and it's unexpended, meaning that it has never been activated and used, well then a small cylindrical cap would need to go over the primer to deny the hammer a path to the percussion cap. With that cap in place, a fall from a bench or a rough taxi over concrete could jostle the cartridges all day long and nothing would really happen. But without it, one sharp jolt could be enough to start the chemical reaction. Now, work card 0069 came frustratingly close to accurately describing the importance of this step, but sadly, it still fell short. It read, if generator has not been expended, install safety cap over primer. If generator has not been expended, install shipping cap on firing pin. But it crucially never defined what expended meant. And it also didn't say anywhere that the generators in any state were potentially hazardous, and it didn't require a specific supervisory sign-off that those caps had been correctly installed. Now, there were instructions for how to store or dispose of removed generators, but that information lived in a separate manual that the mechanics probably never had on hand, and also had no real reason to consult since they had the work card. So this all meant that in a shop where English wasn't everyone's first language and crews rotated across different tasks, instructions like these needed to be absolutely clear, but they weren't. When the replacement job started, the workers soon noticed that the required safety caps had not been stocked by Sabertech. Depending on who you asked, Valujet was supposed to provide peculiar expendables like these caps, or Sabertech should have had them, but either way, they weren't there. Now, Sabertech also worked their employees very hard. The work on these MD-80s was taking longer than expected, so Sabertech responded to this by forcing all of its employees to cancel their time off and work 7 days a week until these planes could be delivered. The managers wanted the airplanes closed up and run out of the bay as soon as possible, so in that pressured environment, people did what they always do when work cards doesn't match the reality of the work that they have in front of them. They improvised. Instead of waiting for the safety caps to come, some mechanics just wrapped the lanyard around the body of the generators and then taped it down, figuring that restraint would stand in for a cap. Others just cut the lanyard to keep an accidental pull from releasing the hammer, but neither one of those tricks actually blocked the hammer from reaching the primer. Soon, the removed generators began to pile up. Some boxes appeared and were subsequently packed full of generators, most of them without those crucial safety caps installed. But the work card sign-offs still moved along, as if the caps would instead be installed somewhere down the chain, even though it was clear that it was a requirement that these should have been installed from the start. Some people said, stores will deal with it, meaning the technical stores that handle spare parts, etc. But stores never did, because no one actually told them. That's the issue of moving away from a set procedure. Things get lost. At one point, a mechanic suggested to his supervisor that they could remove the safety caps from the new generators that they were installing in the MD-80s and use those. But in that case, the work card was more clear. It said that the safety caps were not to be removed for any reason until the unit was safely installed on the plane and had gone through a specific test. So what we're seeing here we can refer to as something like mechanical drift, but the cultural drift also ran right beside it. At some point, one of these generators got bumped and fired, and the result looked pretty modest to the ones watching. A pop, a hiss, the casing too hot to touch, a smell of hot metal, and then, after a dozen minutes or so, nothing. So thinking that the generators were not that dangerous, other mechanics soon gathered around in a circle, and a few more of these generators were lit on purpose. One mechanic told investigators that they did this because they wanted to make them safe, which actually was a pretty good idea, because a spent generator is considerably less dangerous. But once they all realized that the hissing generator, the size of a large Coke can, only emitted a gas with no drama, no flame, nothing cinematic, it bred a dangerous assumption that the cartridges were not much of a threat anyway, even if they hadn't been spent. That assumption then crept into choices. It made storing the generators in a cardboard box feel acceptable, and it made keeping them in the proximity of an airplane feel like a non-event. So Sabertech employees soon started storing these live generators on shelves near and even underneath the planes that they were working on. And on top of all of this, the oversight layer was also really thin here. Valujet had a few tech reps at Sabertech to keep an eye on the work, and at least one of those said that he had flagged the missing caps and pointed out that the boxes of generators were being kept too close to the airplanes. But supervisors on the Sabertech side then later said that they didn't recall having that conversation. Anyway, on May the 5th, the heavy check was closed out and a Sabertech inspector signed the general work card for all 3 Valujet airplanes, certifying the tasks as complete. Now he knew that work card 69 required safety caps on any unexpended passenger oxygen generators, and he also knew that none of them had been installed. But like I said before, his supervisor had assured him that stores would sort that out, so on that promise he signed the tasks away, as his main concern was the new aircraft being completed, not what happened to the old used parts. Soon after that, another Valujet technical rep on site noticed the boxes of oxygen generators near an aircraft and asked that they be moved further away. 2 Sabertech mechanics carried the boxes to the Valujet section of shipping and receiving, which was the usual parking place for company-owned parts. The ownership of the parts was very clear. They belonged to Valujet, but the instruction chain on what to do with them wasn't. It remains unclear who actually told the workers to put the boxes there. No one was manning the counter, so they just sat the boxes down and left, and there was no requirement to log the contents or brief anyone about what was inside of them. On May the 7th, Sabertech's director of logistics then spoke with a Valujet technical rep about parts that were sitting on the Valujet hold area. The rep explained that he was expecting Valujet store staff from Atlanta to visit on May the 9th, 2 days later, to decide on what to do with all of the generators in storage. But then, on May the 8th, anticipating a walkthrough by a prospective customer on May the 12th, Sabertech's director of logistics told the shipping clerk to clean up the area. A previous client had already called the housekeeping unacceptable, and management was determined not to be embarrassed like that twice. Then on May the 9th, the Valujet rep called back again. Turns out that the Atlanta stores team wouldn't arrive until the 13th, after the VIP customer walkthrough that Sabertech expected that weekend. So with no one from Valujet to take care of the boxes before the VIP visit, and with management pressing to clean it up now, Sabertech's logistics staff decided to just return the material to Valujet themselves. And the easiest way to do that was just to get it back to Atlanta to let them deal with it. So said and done, on May the 9th, these boxes were moved to Valujet's shipping and receiving area in order to be prepped for shipment in 5 large boxes. The shipping clerk packed the units in well so that they sat side by side and end to end, and he then added 2 or 3 inches of bubble wrap on top so nothing would rattle. Now, bubble wrap might have seemed like the obvious choice here if you're moving across country and you don't want your commemorative Taylor Swift albums to get damaged, but around a self-heating oxygen source, it's basically a fire's favorite appetizer. And that brings me to what may be the most important moment in this entire failure chain. 3 words, written in ballpoint pen on the shipping ticket. You see, the receiving clerk in the shipping office had no idea what he was looking at in the boxes. He described what he saw as oxygen canisters, and that word, canisters, was all it took to conjure up the wrong picture. Green bottles with valves, the kind that were either full or empty. The receiving clerk simply wrote what he thought he'd heard and what he saw. Oxy canisters, empty. He added quotation marks around empty, and he just glanced at the green tags and assumed, as many non-mechanics would, that green meant no problem. He then read expired and interpreted that as empty, and he had obviously not been briefed on the difference between a generator and a canister. Now, most oxygen canisters are quite large, so 144 of them would have been the size of a large pickup truck, but the clerk didn't think about that. Neither did anyone else from this point on. So in that moment, live chemical generators were transformed into boring company parts, empty bottles that should be totally harmless. That's super important to understand here, because Valujet did not hold approval to carry dangerous goods as cargo on their passenger flights, and oxygen generators definitely were. So if the cargo would have been correctly labeled, it would never have been approved on board. Anyway, when the 5 sealed boxes finally sat on the shipping table, they looked exactly like what the paperwork said that they were. The labels carried Valujet COMAT markings, a designator that meant company material, and the address slips pointed to Atlanta. There was no dangerous goods diamonds and no oxygen generators mentioned, so to anyone downstream, this was just harmless airplane stuff moving from one base to another. 5 minutes before departure of Flight 592, the ramp workers delivered the last things to be loaded onto the aircraft. They brought 3 aircraft tires and 5 sealed COMAT boxes to the forward cargo door of the DC-9 and then worked them into the cargo hold. 1 main tire was put in flat on the floor to make a base. The nose tire was then set on its side on top of it and leaned against the forward bulkhead. The boxes were placed around and over the stack, not wedged tight, just leaned into a pile. Then a second main tire was lifted on edge against the sidewall, leaning slightly over the pile, and then baggage was placed around it. There were no straps or nets to hold everything in place to keep the contents from jostling around, and for a carrier that didn't carry declared dangerous goods, this was completely normal. There was no need to tie down what the paperwork said was just ordinary company material. But as one of the boxes settled, one of the loaders said that he felt something shift inside and that he heard a small clink. He didn't think much more about it then, and when the door came down, the compartment looked tidy enough. The tires were forming a pedestal to keep the boxes stacked together, and the boxes were packed in a ring on top of the middle tire. Just like a fire pit. Now we don't know if the moment that the loader heard that click was the moment that the first generator activated. The NTSB in fact was never able to produce an exact time when the ignition started, but the best they could estimate was that it was somewhere between when the loader placed the last box and when the takeoff roll started. Maybe a jolt jumped the lanyard or tugged the hammer off its detent. We will basically never know. But once the first generator was activated, it would have generated more than enough heat to then activate all of the other generators around it, which would then have ignited the bubble wrap, cardboard and luggage, fueled by an abundance of fresh oxygen. And crucially, to understand how this could be allowed to happen, the forward cargo hold of the DC-9 was not equipped to indicate to the crew that a deadly fire had just started. Had it been, the captain would have likely just aborted the flight on the ground and ordered an emergency evacuation, and Valujet 592 might just have been another small but expensive footnote in history. But this cargo hold had been designated in the 1960s and certified as a Class D compartment. In theory, its safety came from its airtight design with little ventilation and few fresh air pathways. So the idea was that if a small fire ever would start in such a compartment, it would eat whatever oxygen that it could find and then smother itself. But that of course did not take into account cargo that could produce its own oxygen. So there were no sensors to tell the crew that anything bad had started, and there was also no fire bottles plumbed to flood the space with fire suppressants if it was needed. Now, by the time of this flight, there had already been accidents linked to the lack of smoke detectors in Class D compartments. In fact, on February the 3rd, 1988, an American Airlines MD-83 had suffered a cargo fire after improperly stored cargo containers containing hydrogen peroxide and sodium orthosilicate ignited. A few minutes before that flight landed, passengers noticed smoke coming from the floor of the plane. The crew quickly realized the severity of the fire and expedited the landing at the destination in Nashville and then ordered an emergency evacuation. All the passengers escaped with only some minor injuries, and afterwards the NTSB very clearly asked the FAA to make smoke detectors mandatory in all cargo compartments of every class, along with some full fire suppression systems. Now, the FAA did consider the rule, but when it was calculated how much airlines would have had to pay in order to get into compliance, they declined to mandate any changes. Anyway, from the flight deck, obviously none of this was on the mind of the pilots of Flight 592. The captain taxied out the old shining DC-9 towards runway 09 left with nothing to indicate that anything was wrong at all, even as the fire was likely already burning inside the hold. At time 14:03, the captain then pushed the thrust levers into the takeoff position and the DC-9 began to accelerate for a long, steady push down runway 09 left. And a few seconds later, the first officer called out, "V1, rotate." The nose lifted up, followed by the main gear leaving the concrete, and Critter 592 started to climb effortlessly into the clear afternoon air over Miami. The gear was then quickly retracted, the flaps were selected up about 20 seconds later, and the DC-9 settled into that familiar climb howl. Just another routine takeoff on a beautiful day. Departure control soon instructed them to climb higher and to turn left to 300 degrees. The altimeters climbed steadily, the speed sat where it should, and the airplane handled exactly like it was supposed to, which was nice since the autopilot was not available. This was the very kind of day that we pilots love. Great weather with just some occasional storms on the horizon, nothing but sky, coastline, and the quiet choreography of the standard operating procedures being adhered to. The after-takeoff flow was soon completed, the engine instruments showed steady, normal readings, and the pressurization was steadily increasing its differential pressure. The pilot's call-outs were initially unhurried and spaced like they always were on this short leg out of Miami, so the two pilots would have been likely very relaxed here and planning for maybe a cup of coffee before starting to prepare for their arrival into Atlanta later on. Back in the passenger cabin, the same calm and normality also prevailed. The purser did a PA advising people about the bar service that was soon about to commence, and the passengers were likely just looking out from their windows, watching the city fanning out beneath a wingtip and then slipping beyond. The cabin interphone was still not working, so the cabin crew had to open the door in order to talk to the pilots, but at least the PA system had been fixed during the turnaround. Whilst the flight was now progressing in a deceptively calm way, the fire also raged unchecked in the forward cargo hold, and it would soon show itself, but not quite yet. As a side note here, this story really makes the hair stand up on my arms, because as a former firefighter myself, I know just how destructive an uncontained fire can be. I have been sitting inside of a container filled with plywood as we let a fire fully develop, just to watch what happens, and what I saw there was equally beautiful and terrifying. You see, people think of a fire as something confined to a specific place and form, like a campfire crackling away. But what I saw in that container was something completely different. Now, it starts like that, like a campfire, but then when the fire heats up the materials around it, it turns that into that black, thick smoke, which starts creeping downwards from the ceiling as it's building up. Now that smoke is black because it's so full of burnable fuel. So when the mixture of fuel, heat and oxygen reaches a certain point, it just says whoosh, and then everything burns in a flash fire. You will see flames created in front of you in thin air, just to disappear and form somewhere else, and the temperature increases so rapidly that it's impossible to even comprehend. Now, we were in full firefighting gear when we did this experiment, but the temperature increased so quickly that our gear began to melt and we had to get out. In theory, an aircraft will be able to hold together for about 15 minutes after an uncontrollable fire has broken out. So when I hear about a cargo compartment not having neither fire detection or suppression in order to save money, it really makes my blood boil. A fire is the single worst thing that I can think of on board an aircraft, without a single doubt, and it must be avoided. At time 14:10 and 3 seconds, less than 7 minutes after the aircraft had left the ground, the first sign of something being wrong was noted. A dull, padded thump was more felt than heard, rolling up through the pedals and the seat rails in the cockpit. The captain looked up from her instrument and asked, "What was that?" as the altimeter swept through 10,634 feet climbing. That thump was actually one of the loaded tires exploding with such force that the NTSB would later note a massive spike in the static pressure as measured by the static ports near the nose of the aircraft. The first officer simply replied, "I don't know." And soon after that, the aircraft reached its peak altitude of just under 11,000 feet. Suddenly, the entire world began to fall apart in front of the two pilots. Within seconds, multiple warning lights appeared with alarms blaring all over the place, and several systems began to fail left, right and center as the fire started eating through the electrical wire bundles routed past the cargo hold. Are we about to lose a bus? We've got some electrical problem," the captain said, which was a fair assumption since most multiple failures are associated with electrical problems. The first officer scanned the overhead panel and did see some unusual readings from the electrical panel. Yeah, the battery charge is kicking. We've got a..." But then before he could finish that, the captain cut in. "We're losing everything." With no idea what the pilots were now facing, the air traffic controller came in on the radio to say, "Critter 592, contact Miami Center on 132.45. So long." But by this time, the captain had already made up her mind about what needed to be done. They needed to get this aircraft down on the ground now. Less than 20 seconds had elapsed from that first noise, and they were still moving away from the airport when she started over the radio. We need to get back to Miami." In the cabin, the fire had now breached the floor between the galley and the first rows of seats, and that caused the passengers to flee towards the back of the cabin to get away from the flames and choking smoke. On the cockpit voice recorder, the screams and panic from the passengers can clearly be heard, and I don't even want to think about what the cabin crew would have had to deal with as this was happening. But one of their voices could be heard to identify the issue that was happening. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Soon after that, another voice added, "We're on fire! We're on fire!" The controller now chimed in again to make sure that Flight 592 had heard his last instruction. "Critter 592, contact Miami Center 132.45. But now the first officer pressed his radio button and explained clearly. 592 needs immediate return to Miami. Critter 592, roger, turn left heading 270 degrees, descend and maintain 7,000 feet. What kind of problem are you having? The controller responded. The captain, hand-flying the plane with all of her concentration, now calmly responded the worst thing that a pilot can relay to a controller. Fire. The first officer then added, smoke in the cockpit, smoke in the cabin. Now, the task was brutally simple. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Get this plane down on the ground as quickly as possible to save whatever could be saved. In situations like this, we pilots are trained to even consider an off-field landing, as we know that a plane on fire will not hold its structural integrity for very long. In the cargo hold below them, the fire had now completely broken through the supposedly fireproof liner, and the heat had found some of the aircraft's most important components. Wiring looms, control runs, the paths that carry the commands from the pilots to the control surfaces. So whilst you can fly a DC-9 through a lot of abuse, the fire was now starting to eat into systems that the pilots could not do without. The captain had now turned and put the plane into a rapid descent, and whilst doing that, she also pulled the thrust levers all the way back to idle. But the left engine now wouldn't respond because the fire had already eaten through its control cables. This meant that the captain now also would need to deal with asymmetric thrusts as she started to move back towards Miami. On top of that, the broken interphone now also suddenly mattered, because without it, flight attendants couldn't talk to the cockpit unless they opened the door, which would then allow smoke to pour into the cockpit. But they had no choice. The door soon flew open and one of the flight attendants let out, "Completely on fire," before she slammed the door shut again. Now that would not have come as a surprise to the two pilots, who were now already doing what they could to get the aircraft back towards the airport. At this point, they didn't discuss or try to diagnose anything, nor did it seem like they'd donned their oxygen masks or smoke goggles. The reason for this is a little bit unclear, but most likely the smoke was not perceived as being so bad in the cockpit that they thought about prioritizing this. There simply wasn't any time to problem solve or to do anything other than just to try to get the aircraft down. If you are a pilot out there and you find yourself in this kind of a situation, donning the oxygen mask is an absolute must. Smoke and fumes can be insidious, and you might not even realize that they're about to overcome you. Today's oxygen masks and smoke goggles are a much faster donning type than back then, partly as a result of what happened on this flight, so please use them. Anyway, the pilots kept working and tried everything that they could to start preparing the aircraft for landing, but the plane was now fighting them as it started to fall apart. A control cable to one of the elevators grew tight and then likely snapped completely, causing the plane to lurch upwards before the captain managed to bring it back under control and continue the descent. The first officer soon toggled his radio button again and called Miami Center. "Critter 592, we need the closest airport available." The controller at Miami Center would later tell investigators that he didn't hear that request because another flight had called at that very moment, but it is very doubtful it would have made any difference anyway, because Valujet Flight 592 was at this point already in its last moments. Still, the controller continued his job and soon called the flight back saying, "Critter 592, the fire trucks are going to be standing by for you. You can plan runway 12 when able, direct to Dolphin now." From the cabin, 6 cabin chimes could be heard, and the cockpit voice recorder picked up someone on the interphone saying, "Okay, we need oxygen. We can't get oxygen back here," just showing how desperate things were now becoming. The pilots obviously couldn't hear this since the interphone wasn't working, and they were completely focused on one single mission: get back to the airport. And they weren't aiming for any particular runway at this point, they were just aiming for Miami Airport, hoping that beyond hope they could get this nightmare down on the ground. Now, their DC-9 still responded to control inputs at first. Control wheel and column movements produced the expected roll and pitch, but the forces quickly grew heavier as the forward fuselage heated up. Cable runs and pulleys for the primary flight controls passed beneath the cockpit and forward cabin floor, right where the fire was now raging. And the rising temperatures softened cable sheets and liners, increased friction in pulleys, and changed cable tension. All of this made the controls feel stiff and imprecise, so the crew would have needed to use bigger inputs to get the response that they wanted. For a short time, this was still manageable. The wings stayed level when commanded, the nose went where it was pointed, and the airplane was steadily turning back towards Miami. But as the heat load increased, local structure and brackets warped, insulation burned away, and wiring looms and control runs began to completely disintegrate. At this point, this fire was pure hellish inferno. The NTSB later recreated the conditions of the fire in a test chamber, and the fire achieved temperatures well over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The peak intensity is unknown because it exceeded the capability of the test instruments, but it easily burned through the supposedly fireproof lining in the cargo compartment. 15 seconds after the last call from the first officer, the fire started to eat at the wires controlling the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, so from that point both of them would record only intermittently. A second call from the first officer asking for radar vectors was garbled as the fire destroyed the radios, and that was the last thing anyone would ever hear from Valujet Flight 592. Roughly 3 minutes after the first fire call, the plane leveled off at 7,400 feet. Eventually, one of the elevator control cables slackened and failed, causing the plane to enter a nearly vertical 12,000 feet per minute dive. But then, Somehow, the crew used the limited authority that they still had over the trim tabs and elevators and got the wings back to level for just a moment, just a few hundred feet over the swampy waters of the Everglades. Investigators would later note the possibility that the fire had burnt through the captain's control cables and that the first officer might have taken over to pull them out at the very last moment. In any case, the two pilots were refusing to give up, and they were now working the jet to the edge of what it had left. But the fire wasn't finished. Another minute passed, and the intermittently recorded soundscape on the cockpit voice recorder changed again. Alerts that hadn't already died fell silent as the fire ate through the last of the electrical wires. The tone of the wind grew stronger as the speed ran up in the coming descent, and at this point there were no more sounds from the pilots, and the screams from the cabin had completely died down. Even if someone was still alive at this point, the plane would have been barely controllable. And here, it is worth pointing out how that other system that the FAA had declined to mandate might have saved them. You see, while a smoke detector would have alerted them to the fire shortly after it ignited, a suppression system with halon gas may have slowed the fire enough to give them a fighting chance. It would not have had any possibility of extinguishing the fire since it was producing its own oxygen, but it might have bought them an extra few minutes. And in a different timeline, with a fire in the cargo hold and a halon bottle discharging its contents, that would have been enough. But without it, they had now just run out of time. In the last half minute before the end of the recording, the airplane pitched down again and the roll increased. The view out of the windscreen went from horizon and swamp to more swamp and less horizon. Every link that had failed during the previous months had now come to this. A cargo space with no detector, a load that had been misnamed, safety caps that had not been fitted, a policy that assumed honesty where there had been confusion, and a design that counted on a fire needing air. The CVR in the last few seconds captured almost nothing. No more voices, no more alarms, only the sound of wind. The DC-9 finally gave up. It rolled hard to the right as the asymmetric thrust pushed the plane hard over. The nose fell until the plane was nearly vertical, and in full view of a handful of fishermen, it slammed into the marshy waters of the Florida Everglades at over 400 knots. When that happened, only 3.5 minutes had passed since the tire in the hold had burst and the pilots realized that something was wrong. All 110 people on board were instantly killed on impact, if anyone was even alive at that point. The Everglades turned the investigation into a slog through heat, water and mud. Teams were ferried in by helicopter and boat, then lined up 5 abreast, shoulder to shoulder, wading gridded squares rather than diving. There was no wreckage field, just shallow water over deep muck that swallowed anything heavier than an in-flight magazine. One of the flight recorders was literally found underfoot when a searcher stepped on the box in the deep mud. Wildlife also wasn't just a backdrop, it was a really real hazard. Sharpshooters stood watch for alligators and snakes, while recovery crews worked in the open water, heads down, hands sweeping the bottom for anything recognizable. The impact had been so violent and the conditions so hostile that in the end, only 68 of the 110 people on board were ever positively identified. In the months after the crash, the fixes came fast and finally addressed the blind spots that Flight 592 had exposed. The big one came first. Class D cargo holds were effectively abolished. Regulators upgraded the standard, so the old airtight box philosophy was no longer acceptable. Compartments needed smoke detection and built-in fire suppression. Compliance dates were set and fleets were retrofitted. The second big change was around hazardous materials. The rules were tightened so that devices designed as chemical oxygen generators could not ride as cargo on passenger flights. Full stop. The FAA was told to increase their oversight into both airlines and maintenance providers, and across the industry, the combination of detectors, suppression and disciplined dangerous goods controls closed the gaps that had doomed Flight 592. But today, another threat is rising, and that's the lithium battery fires. My team and I have made several videos about this over on our sister channel, Mentor Now, and we will keep informing the people out there to make sure that people understand the importance of following packaging and baggage rules when it comes to these type of batteries. Like in a nightmare, so many things went wrong here on so many levels. But why? What actually happened? Stay tuned. I often get asked which the safest and least safe airline in the world is, and I always answer the same thing. All airlines are forced to follow very similar standards, so as long as they are allowed to operate, they are all safe. But there are some out there who definitely get into more accidents than others, and one of them is the Colombian airline Aerosucre. This is a cargo airline that has been serving less developed parts of Colombia since all the way back in 1969. And they have done so using a fleet that has varied over the years, but now consists of several Boeing 727s as well as 737-200s, 300s and 400s. Since it was founded, Aerosucre has had 11 fatal accidents and many more non-fatal ones, meaning that the airline has actually written off significantly more airplanes over its history than it has ever owned at any given time. For example, back in 1989, 5 crew and 2 people on the ground died when an Aerosucre Caravelle suffered a load shift, lost control and then crashed into several houses. And later that same year, another Aerosucre flight flew straight into a mountain, killing 6 people. Then in 1991, 2 persons died and several were injured when an Aerosucre DC-6 landed short of the runway in Barranquilla, and that flight, which was supposed to be a pure cargo flight, turned out to also be carrying at least 19 unauthorized passengers who had all gotten handwritten tickets through relatives that worked with the company. And these poor passengers had, according to reports, been sitting on the floor of the cargo area next to some crates of newspapers during the crash, since there were no seats fitted. Later, another deadly accident took place in 2006 when an Aerosucre 727 on approach hit a radio tower, killing all 6 crew members on board. And if that wasn't enough, they have also written off quite a few aircraft due to landing gear collapses. Plus, they've had a number of other emergencies, like in 2021 when the cargo door of this 737 came open in flight. Now, it is important to keep in mind that throughout most of Aerosucre's existence, Colombia has been embroiled in a long-running civil war that strained its infrastructure and oversight, so it wasn't always easy to operate safely, even if they were trying. And that's a big if. Now, despite their poor safety record, Aerosucre provides a vital service to some remote towns and cities in Colombia that would otherwise struggle to maintain supplies of basic goods or be unable to export their local products to market. And for that reason, Aerosucre's longtime owner was actually given a state award in 2013 for service to the country. But 2 years after receiving that award, he himself nearly died in a plane crash where he was pilot flying. Anyway, this is just supposed to give you some background, which might make the story that I'm about to tell you a bit easier to understand. And for that story, we need to go back to the 20th of December of 2016. On that day, an Aerosucre Boeing 727 and its crew were scheduled to operate a round trip between El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá to Germán Otano Airport in the remote town of Puerto Carreño, situated in the far eastern part of the country. Puerto Carreño is located along the Orinoco River, which forms part of Colombia's border with Venezuela, and Germán Otano Airport is actually surrounded by Venezuelan territory on 3 sides. When the inbound flight arrived at the airport, they flew the approach from the Colombian side, using runway 07, like most aircraft who use this airport tends to do, and that's an issue that I'll get back to later. Anyway, after the aircraft landed at 14:48 local time, the crew then supervised the ground personnel as they unloaded 9,300 kilograms of perishable foods and sundries to resupply the town. That was then followed by the loading of 9 pallets containing 19,800 kilograms of local products going for export, meaning that the crew knew that they would be substantially heavier on the homebound flight than they had been when they arrived. But who were the crew members who were operating on this afternoon then? Well, we don't actually know that much about them, except that they were supposed to be 5 crew members on board: a captain, a first officer, a flight engineer, a mechanic, and finally a loadmaster. The captain was 58 years old and had 8,708 total flying hours, including 6,822 hours on the Boeing 727. But he was the only crew member whose full records were actually available. The first officer was 39 years old, and according to Aerosucre's company records, he had 3,285 hours, all of which had been flown on the Boeing 727, but there were no record of any experience he might have gained before joining the company. Lastly, the flight engineer was 72 years old and had 1,612 hours on the Boeing 727 at Aerosucre, but again, there was no information about what he had done before that, and he had joined Aerosucre in 2013, 3 years before this flight, so he almost certainly had extensive experience with previous employers given his age. And when we're on the subject of his age, the fact that he was 72 years old might surprise a few of you guys out there, since pilots normally retire by either 60 or 65 years old. Well, it turns out that in a lot of countries, there actually is no age limit for flight engineers, and even in the places where there is a limit, it's often much higher than it is for pilots. In fact, in the United States, it used to be somewhat common for captains who had aged out of the left seat to become flight engineers so that they could keep flying for a couple of more years. But having said that, 72 definitely makes him the oldest flight engineer that I've ever heard of in active duty. As for the mechanic and the loadmaster, we don't know anything about them at all, and that's likely because their roles didn't make much of a difference to the outcome of this story. Interestingly though, while the flight was only supposed to have 5 crew members, a 6th person was later found to have been on board, and the sources we have looked at doesn't say who that person was. But it might have been an undocumented passenger, since Aerosucre had, like I mentioned earlier, a history of carrying those. The aircraft they were operating on this day was a 41-year-old beautiful 3-engine Boeing 727-200, which had been originally manufactured back in 1975. It had then been operated for many years in the United States before it was retired in 2007, at which point Aerosucre bought it and re-registered it in Colombia, possibly to replace one of the company's other 727s that had crashed a year earlier. Then in 2015, Aerosucre modified this aircraft according to a third-party retrofit package called Quiet Wing, which came with a supplemental type certificate, basically an addition to the original Boeing 727 type specifications approved by the FAA. The idea behind the Quiet Wing was to reduce the amount of noise generated during takeoff and landing, and also to improve its performance. This was done in part by adding new takeoff flap settings, which would allow the 727 to take off from shorter runways using lower speeds and therefore requiring less engine power and fuel. On the standard 727, the maximum takeoff flap setting was 25 degrees, but with the Quiet Wing modifications, it now became possible to also take off with flaps 30. Now, the flap settings that we pilots choose to use affects how we determine the takeoff, or V speeds, that is V1, the decision speed, VR, rotation speed, and V2, the safe engine out speed. Generally speaking, the higher the flap setting, the lower these speeds will become, since the wings will be able to provide more lift and therefore allow the aircraft to get airborne earlier. But with the addition of flaps 30, this also meant that the flight crew needed a new set of tables in order to determine these V speeds, tables taking weight, temperature and wind into account. The designers of the Quiet Wing modification had provided a supplement to the aircraft flight manual that included instructions for how to calculate these new V speeds with flaps 30, which Aerosucre should have used to then develop new quick reference takeoff cards for its pilots. These cards allow the pilots to quickly reference the required takeoff speeds without having to flip through pages and pages in the performance manuals and pore over complicated charts. But Aerosucre had never made these new takeoff cards, so the only way that the pilots could determine the correct flap 30 V speeds was by examining those charts in the manuals, which was pretty inconvenient on a daily basis. Now, to me, as someone who flies in a well-regulated environment, it's almost inconceivable that an airline would fail to do something that basic. But not only did Aerosucre fail to do this, apparently Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority didn't exercise any oversight of the modification process at all, even though they signed off on it, meaning that they also failed to catch this obvious error. But that wasn't the only major problem with Aerosucre's 727 operation into Germán Olano Airport. Because it turns out that they actually never had permission to fly this particular aircraft in there in the first place. You see, the runway width and pavement strength at the airport were both below the minimum values required for the Boeing 727, so it wasn't actually legal to conduct routine 727 operations there at all. Now, like any airline, Aerosucre had to acquire operational authorization from the civil aviation authorities for the relevant country, in this case Colombia, for every aircraft type and route combination that they intended to fly. But the operational authorization document approved by Colombia's CAA clearly specified that only Boeing 737 operations were permitted at Germán Olano Airport. And despite this, Aerosucre just ignored that and started flying there with its 727s anyway. And not only that, before every flight, the airline submitted a flight plan to the CAA for air traffic control purposes. And these flight plans seem to have then been just approved, apparently without any checking which aircraft type was actually being used. Now, neither the runway width nor the pavement strength was a factor in this accident, but obviously, if the regulations had been properly enforced, this flight would have never taken place, and this accident would therefore have been prevented. It is worth pointing out here that aviation is as safe as it is today because we build safety margins into every part of the operation. That ethos is supposed to start at the international level and then move down through the national regulators out to the airlines and then finally to the operating crews through laws, regulations, procedures and training. When this works well, there are so much margins in there that a singular or even several errors can slip through without something really bad happening. But when these rules are ignored, then the margins are thinned out until finally it comes down to a singular human mistake. After the cargo was loaded, the crew of Aerosucre Flight 157 carried out their pre-flight checks and then started up the 727's 3 Pratt & Whitney JT8 Delta engines. Once they were up and running, that also activated the cockpit voice recording, which means that we know what was said in the cockpit from that point onwards. The time was now 1700 and the control tower had actually closed for the day at 1500, meaning that the airport was now uncontrolled. So, to let other aircraft know their intentions, the first officer sent out a blind message addressed to all aircraft in the Puerto Carreño area on the common terminal frequency. And he stated Flight 157's intention to taxi to the active runway via taxiway Bravo. The pilots then completed their standard control checks and also double-checked the takeoff items, including flaps, which they had set to the maximum 30 degrees in order to help them take off from the short, 1,800 meter long runway. They also reviewed the previously calculated engine power settings, or EPRs, and the captain then called out a value of 23 for both V1 and VR. He likely meant 123 knots here, but the first officer corrected him to 127 knots, which is what they had calculated before. After accepting that, the captain, who was going to be pilot flying for the leg, then conducted a takeoff briefing in which he explained that the flight engineer would add takeoff power, the first officer would then call out 60 and 80 knots, then V1 and VR at 127 knots, and finally V2 at 141 knots. He also discussed who would monitor the instruments and what they would do in the event of an engine failure, both before and after decision speed, so far, so good. Now, there are 3 things about this briefing that is worth pointing out before we continue. The first is that the V speeds they were using corresponded to an aircraft weight of 75,300 kilos, but the cargo and fuel information suggested that the weight of the aircraft was only 74,200 kilos, a full 1.1 ton less. Based on the runway length and the outside temperature of 31 degrees Celsius, the maximum takeoff weight for this runway would have been 74,700 kilos, which was higher than the aircraft's actual weight calculated by investigators. But it was apparently very common for Aerosucre to overload its aircraft with extra cargo that wasn't on the manifest in order to make the takeoff weight appear to be within limits. So the crew possibly used V speeds corresponding to 75,300 kilos in order to account for this. It's hard to know for sure. Now, the higher V-speeds resulting from using this higher weight would have slightly extended the takeoff roll, but it was still possible to take off even with a 600 kilo overweight. But here we come to the second problem, because it turns out that the speeds selected by the crew were actually for a flaps 25 takeoff and not a flaps 30 takeoff. This was probably because, remember, Aerosucre hadn't updated the takeoff card for flaps 30, so the pilots were just using the flaps 25 speeds from the old takeoff cards instead. Now, this should be safe since those speeds were actually higher, but if the crew would have used the correct V-speeds here, then the V1 and VR speeds would have been 122 instead of 127 knots, allowing them to rotate 5 knots sooner. Investigators later calculated that in the time required to accelerate these extra 5 knots, the aircraft would eat up an extra 103 meters of runway, which on a runway that's short isn't really something they could afford. Now, the next thing I want to note about the captain's takeoff briefing is what wasn't in it. A takeoff briefing should include discussions of the runway in use, possibly the weight, but definitely the existing weather conditions and wind. At the time the aircraft was taxiing out, the runway in use for takeoff was runway 07, since the wind was out of the northeast. But at this point, the crew hadn't discussed the weather conditions at all. In fact, on this day, Aerosucre's dispatch department never provided Flight 157 with any weather information at all before departure, and the tower was, like I mentioned, closed. So as the pilots were taxiing out towards runway 25, the opposite runway than the one that was in use, the captain actually asked, don't know what the wind is, but none of the other crew members even acknowledged him. A few moments later he asked, but it's light, yes or no? To which the first officer replied, yeah, it is light. Apparently the pilots had decided, without much data to back it up, that the wind was light enough that they didn't even have to take it into account, even though there was a weather office that they could have called in order to get the actual wind information. Now, this is the attitude that most of us have when we're out driving our cars. Maybe we'll glance outside before we go to see if it's sunny, raining or snowing, and then we might modify our driving style a little bit depending on what we see, but that's about it. Most of the time that's absolutely fine, but sometimes we end up in a ditch and we need a tow because it was just a little bit more slippery than we thought. In an aircraft though, we just can't afford to operate that way. Remember what I said about margins earlier on? We should always make sure that we have the margins with us and not against us. So when we fly, we have to be super diligent with all details, like the wind. In this case, there was a 4-knot wind out of northeast, which slightly favored runway 07 for takeoff instead of runway 25, which the crew were now going for. Now 4 knots isn't a lot, but when you are an overweight 727 taking off from a 1,800 meter runway with V-speeds that are too high, it just means again smaller margins. The pilots likely noticed that there was a light tailwind from runway 25 because they taxied past a windsock on their way out to the takeoff position, but that didn't change their minds. Now there are a few factors that I think could possibly have contributed to that decision. You see, taking off from runway 07 wasn't as simple as using runway 25, not only because it pointed away from the destination, but also because of the proximity to the Venezuelan border, located only 2.8 kilometers away from the departure end of runway 07. Now, I can't say for sure whether there were any airspace restrictions or anything like that, but flight radar data shows that most flights using Germán Molano Airport do take off from runway 25, and the few that uses runway 07 often execute a very sharp turn right after takeoff, likely to minimize entry into Venezuela. It's quite possible that entering Venezuelan airspace requires some extra paperwork or communication with air traffic control, which the pilots could have been aware of. Now, 2 other aircraft did take off from runway 07 shortly before Flight 157 departed, but these were a Cessna 208 and an Embraer 170, which are much smaller and more maneuverable, and could therefore probably have made a turn that the heavier 727 just would not be able to do. In any case, whatever the reason was, the crew was probably used to taking off from runway 25 unless the tailwind was very strong, so as long as they perceived it to be light, they likely didn't worry too much about it. But investigators later calculated that 4-knot tailwind would add another 146 meters to the takeoff distance, so things were now starting to add up. After completing the before takeoff checklist, the pilots taxied up to the head of runway 25 and then made a 180-degree turn, during which the first officer again announced their intentions over the common frequency. As soon as they were lined up, the captain called for takeoff thrust to be set, and the flight engineer advanced the thrust levels to the predetermined EPRs. So at time 17:18, they started accelerating down the runway. At this point, local plane spotters had gathered at the far end of the runway to watch the sleek 727 takeoff, and it was no coincidence that they were there to watch this particular flight. Aerosucre had a history of dramatic takeoffs from this particular runway, where on multiple occasions their 727s and 737s had been filmed making very long takeoff rolls, overflying plane spotters by just a few meters. And on at least 2 of these occasions, the aircraft had also nearly struck the 2-meter-high perimeter fence located 60 meters past the runway end, as well as a tree and a military guard post 76 meters further downrange. These earlier passes had been so close that they had enveloped the plane spotters in clouds of dust and left the tree branches swaying. So, for some of the enthusiasts positioned right at the end of runway 25, this was probably a bit of a thrill-seeking adventure. And they ended up getting way more than they had bargained for. I also want to add here that the placement of that fence, tree and guard post also didn't comply with international obstacle clearance regulations, since they penetrated into something known as the protected takeoff area. This area is defined by a specific slope starting from the runway end, and any obstacle that penetrates this slope has to be either removed or shortened, or if that can't be done, they must be mentioned on the airport charts and included in the aircraft's takeoff performance calculations. But here, none of that had been done, which again highlights the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority's lack of proper enforcement, as well as another safety margin removed. Anyway, the existence of multiple videos of aircraft nearly striking these obstacles also says a lot about Aerosucre's operations. Since their planes had been filmed nearly overrunning this very same runway at least twice, we have to ask ourselves why, and how many times that this has happened without it being caught on camera. Every aircraft must be able to pass the departure and runway at a minimum altitude of 35 feet, even after an engine failure, but that was clearly being routinely violated here. This leads me to believe that the excess weight, wrong V-speeds and disregard for the weather were probably also present on countless previous flights, leading flight crews to become accustomed to operating with little or maybe even no margin for error. I can see how it can be tempting to dismiss the significance of 600 kilos here, 5 knots difference in rotation speed there, a 4-knot tailwind here, but the problem is that these little variations are only academic until they suddenly aren't. Now, even with these factors in place, Flight 157 should still have been able to become airborne just before the end of the runway, and if that would have happened, we probably wouldn't be talking about this flight right now. But unfortunately, there was still one last thing that tipped them over the edge. Remember that one human mistake? As the 727 began to accelerate down the runway, the first officer soon called out, "Speed alive," and then 60 knots. The captain replied, "Check," followed by the first officer calling out 80 knots and also reaffirming that the decision and rotation speed were both at 127 knots. 12 seconds later, the first officer called out V1, rotate, and the captain began to rotate the aircraft, but he did so very, very slowly. The standard rotation rate on the Boeing 727 is about 2 to 3 degrees per second until the aircraft gets airborne at around 8 to 10 degrees. But here, the captain rotated at only 1 degree per second, less than half of the proper rate, and that effectively doubled the time required to reach the takeoff angle. During that time, the aircraft consumed another 134 meters of extra runway, only now they didn't have those 135 meters to spare. 7 seconds after the rotation call, Flight 157 ran off the end of the paved runway with its nose in the air and just barely becoming airborne as it crossed a short stretch of grass. But it was now far too late to avoid those other obstacles at the end of the runway. The rear fuselage soon crushed the airport perimeter fence as the airplane streaked across the road where the plane spotters now desperately threw themselves out of the way. And through some miracle, none of them were actually hurt. The airplane then continued its trajectory forward, where it struck both a tree and the guard post with its right main landing gear, right trailing edge flaps, and the number 3 engine, raising a huge cloud of dust and scattered debris as it did so. Despite these impacts and the massive damage it caused, the airplane then started climbing, with several alarms and warnings blaring in the cockpit. Now, the cockpit voice recorder cut out for about 10 seconds right after the impact, so we don't know exactly what the pilot's initial reaction was to the collision. But when it came back online, the captain exclaimed, "Number 3 went! Engine 3, brother!" The first officer asked to confirm that engine number 3 had actually failed, and the captain confirmed that, yeah, that's what he meant. But the total extent of the damage to the aircraft was much worse than the pilots probably realized. Not only had the number 3 engine on the right side ingested loads of debris and therefore failed, but one of the right trailing edge flaps had also been completely removed, and the entire right main landing gear, with its door still attached, had been entirely torn off and thrown more than 400 meters away from the point of impact. The loss of the right main landing gear was especially devastating because it severed hydraulic lines belonging to both of the 727's redundant hydraulic system A and B, which now quickly started losing pressure. Now, you might ask how it was possible that damage to one landing gear could end up depleting both hydraulic systems, but this had to do with the fact that whilst the landing gear retraction was handled by hydraulic system A alone, the brakes were handled primarily by system B. And it is hard to design a system with redundancy for entire airplane parts being ripped off. So the aircraft was now climbing, but in a very precarious state, with the partial loss of lift on the right wing, loss of thrust on the right engine, and rapidly depleting hydraulic pressures. As the aircraft struggled to gain altitude, the ground proximity warning system repeatedly started announcing "caution, terrain," and the captain soon suggested that they should turn around for an immediate landing, even though they were well over maximum landing weight. Now, thinking about a plan is generally a good idea, but they were nowhere near that stage in their decision-making. Instead, here it was all about keeping the aircraft in the air, aviating in other words. The first officer now tried to raise the gear, and it turns out that there actually was enough pressure left to raise the remaining bogies, but the right gear obviously indicated unsafe since it was no longer attached to the airplane. When he saw that, the first officer called out, "Right gear!" But at the same time, the captain also said, "Shut down engine number 3, whilst the flight engineer called out, "I lost hydraulic A." This was a truly chaotic, nightmare situation, and when faced with something like this, something known as short-term decision-making is put to the test. That's when there isn't enough time to reach for checklists or fully discuss what's going on. Instead, the actions need to be prioritized and executed based on experience, training, and technical knowledge. But if any of those are lacking, like in this case where the crew was faced with multiple failures likely never seen together in a training scenario, panic can very quickly start to set in, and when there is panic, bad decisions will be taken. As the captain tried to figure out what to do next, the first officer suggested that they lower the gear again, and without almost any hesitation, the captain just agreed. Now, this course of action really makes no sense if you think about it. With the airplane struggling to climb due to the loss of lift and thrust, the last thing you want is to extend the landing gear, since that would immediately increase the drag and make it even harder to maintain the safe airspeed and keep the airplane under control. But given the captain's very fast reaction to the first officer's suggestion, it seems likely that putting the gear back down was a panicked response to the unsafe gear indication and not something that the pilots actually took some time to analyze before doing. And this action would definitely make things much worse for them, as we will soon see. By the time the gear was now lowered again, almost all of the hydraulic fluid had been lost from both the main hydraulic systems. The Boeing 727 has backup manual control cables for the elevators, ailerons and pitch trim, but these require the pilots to move them using muscle power, and that requires a lot of strength for every input. On top of that, the 727's rudder doesn't have a cable-operated backup. Instead, it's powered by both main hydraulic systems as well as a third, independent standby system that can be activated by flipping the standby rudder switch on the aft overhead panel. In the event of an engine failure, we pilots know that the first important thing to do is to use the rudder to cancel out the yawing movement caused by the asymmetric thrust. But, of course, what they were now facing was no ordinary engine failure. Since the right main gear had been removed, causing the total loss of both main hydraulic systems, this now meant that the normal redundancy for the rudder control had been completely lost. This in turn meant that the airplane now started yawing towards the failed right engine as the asymmetric thrust pushed the nose that way, and the normal counteraction of this movement using the left rudder was made impossible, unless the flight engineer would activate that standby rudder switch. If he would have done so, it would have been theoretically possible to get the plane back under control and maybe even make an emergency landing at a later point. But unfortunately, amid the chaos and panic, this never happened, and I actually don't really blame him. Like I said before, this was a scenario none of them would have ever seen before, and activating that switch would have formed part of an emergency checklist that normally would have been done after having properly identified the malfunction, something that they just didn't have time to do in this scenario. And now, since the landing gear was down causing loads of extra drag, the airplane also started to lose its speed, and at lower speeds, control authority from the flight controls had reduced even more. The captain tried to keep the wings level by using the ailerons, but the yaw was still getting worse, and since their speed was now also dropping, he was losing aileron authority. As he fought to maintain control, the first officer applied maximum power on the remaining engines, while both pilots called for each other to fly it gently. The airplane climbed to a maximum altitude of 790 feet, at which point its speed had just dropped too much and it now started descending instead. This caused multiple terrain warnings to again blare out in the cockpit, and the captain also warned that they were on the verge of stalling. Meanwhile, the flight engineer frantically began to try to dump fuel to reduce the weight of the airplane, but it was too late for that, since to dump fuel in any meaningful amount takes a lot of time. Time that they just didn't have. The fuel jettison valve still opened up and the fuel started pouring out from the wings, but it really didn't help. As the airplane now embarked on a slow descending right-hand turn, the captain exclaimed that the plane wasn't accelerating, and he now also asked the first officer to raise the landing gear again, likely finally realizing that in their initial panic they had made a very bad mistake in extending it. But of course, when the first officer tried to raise the gear, it wouldn't come back up since there was now no hydraulic fluid left to lift it. It was likely at this point it became clear they were both out of time and out of options. Impact was now imminent. The pilots started engaging in panic back and forth discussions about raising or lowering the gear, even though there was nothing that they could do about it. And as that was happening, the stick shaker had now also started rattling away, confirming the captain's earlier comments about the aircraft being close to a stall. But the captain kept trying desperately to remain airborne, despite insufficient airspeed and a still worsening yaw, now just a few dozen meters above the ground. Seconds later, the speed finally became so low that it couldn't support flight with this increasing bank angle. The aircraft stalled, meaning an uncontrolled loss of lift, which caused a final steep bank over to the right and straight into the ground, within viewing distance from the airport. And the entire flight had at this point lasted only 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Now the aircraft impacted with its nose and right wing first, causing it to immediately roll over inverted before both wings separated and the cockpit snapped off. A large explosion then consumed most of the wreckage as the fuel load completely combusted, and the severed cockpit came to a rest away from the flames, but even though that was the case, 4 out of the people on board had died instantly from the impact forces, and 1 succumbed to his injuries later at the hospital. But the mechanic actually managed to survive, and despite suffering serious injuries, he was somehow able to escape from the wreckage, where he was soon assisted by bystanders and rescuers. Colombia's Accident Investigation Group concluded that the causes of the accident were inadequate flight planning by the crew and the airline, improper decision-making by the flight crew, and the captain's improper rotation technique. The illegal use of a 727 at an unapproved airport, the airline's failure to modify the takeoff cards, the excessive weight, the lax oversight from the Civil Aviation Authority, and the crew's failure to activate the standby rudder hydraulic system were all cited as contributing factors. But while the flight crew made several serious mistakes here, it's also obvious that this accident could likely only have taken place within the dangerously lax operating culture at Aerosucre. The investigators therefore made several recommendations, mostly just suggesting that Aerosucre should comply with basic regulations and that the Civil Aviation Authority should actually enforce them, which seems like a pretty low bar to reach if you ask me. But if there is one thing that I want everyone to take away from this video, whether you're a pilot, an airline manager, or you work in some other industry where safety is important, it's this. If you start to recognize frequent omissions or little breaches of procedures, even if they don't seem all that significant at the moment, it's a sign that the holes in the Swiss cheese are now growing bigger. If that kind of culture is allowed to last long enough, then an accident becomes not only possible but almost inevitable. Margins are there to minimize the impact of unforced errors, and if they are taken away or ignored, eventually bad things will happen. Now, this video was made possible partly by the supporting members of my Patreon crew, who makes it possible for me to hire new team members and expand into even bigger and better productions. If you enjoy this content, you can join us as well using the link in the description below, which is patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.